And welcome to another exciting edition of Anatomy and Physiology Podcast with Mr. Zabel. In today's lesson, what we're going to be looking at is the endocrine system. Now, the endocrine system, as well as our nervous system, are going to be two major systems that are going to be very important with maintaining homeostasis. And that's the major function of our endocrine system, is to maintain homeostasis. How do we have this set point, and how do we actually go through maintaining it? So if we go further away from that set point, either above it or below it, how do we come back to it? And that's exactly what we're going to be looking at, is how the endocrine system and the nervous system both work together to maintain homeostasis. So when we look at the endocrine system, we can see that it overall plays a major function in maintaining homeostasis. And that's kind of broad, but how specifically does the endocrine system help maintain this homeostasis? Well, if we look at the human body, we can see that there's a lot of different areas that need to have this constant set point. And so being able to maintain homeostasis is a major and crucial function for our bodies to work and operate properly. And so here are some major functions of the endocrine system to see how it is actually working in our bodies. First of all, it's going to be important with regulating growth. So when we look at your tissues, your cells, and your bones, it's going to regulate how fast they grow and how much bone growth you will have. It's going to also be important with maintaining metabolism. When we look at your metabolism, it's broken down into a catabolic rate and an anabolic rate. Your catabolic rate is basically you taking in a sugar molecule and then breaking it down, whereas anabolic rates are looking at building things up. And so when we look at the average between your anabolic rate and your catabolic rate, that's going to give us your metabolism. It's also going to be very important when it comes to regulating the blood glucose, the blood sugar levels, which will also regulate then the water balance level as well. Remember, we've talked about how water wants to follow the sugar, and we're going to look at how the endocrine system is going to kind of balance these two things out. It's also going to be very important in regulating the ion concentrations, the number of sodium ions, potassium ions, calcium ions in our blood. It's also going to regulate the heart rate and the blood pressure. And so when your blood pressure drops, what's going to happen to your heart rate? Well, it's going to increase it. And then vice versa. If our blood pressure is going up, what will happen to our heart rate? Well, it's going to decrease. And so we're going to look at specifically how the endocrine system works and operates in our heart rate and blood pressure. It's also going to help control our production of our immune system. And so when we fight infections, how do we go about doing that? How does that endocrine system play a role in it? It's also going to help us with regulating uterine contractions. So during delivery, we've kind of already talked about this, but that's an example of a positive feedback loop. But how do we actually use the endocrine system to start these contractions? And then finally, once that baby is born, the mother is going to start producing milk. And so the endocrine system is going to be important with stimulating milk production. And so all of these are going to be very important, and we have to use them in order to maintain homeostasis. And without the endocrine system, we won't be able to do that. So the major way in which the endocrine system works and operates is through chemical signals. And these chemical signals, or ligands, are basically molecules that are released from one location that move to another location to produce a response. When we look at the chemical signals, they're broken down into two major categories or classifications. We can break them down into intracellular chemical signals or intercellular chemical signals. So again, you're going to want to know the difference between intracellular and intercellular. Intracellular chemical signals are going to be produced from one part of the cell that travel to another part of that same cell. So these are going to stay within that one cell. Whereas intercellular chemical signals are going to be released from one cell, and they're going to be carried to the intercellular fluid to bind to another cell. So again, this is the same cell, whereas this is going from one cell to a different cell. So if we take a look at the category intercellular chemical signals, again, these are going to be cells that produce some sort of chemical signal that will then be released out of that cell, and it'll interact with another type of cell. There are 6 basic types of ways in which we can have these intercellular chemical signals released. And so 2 of the 6 include the autocrine chemical signals and the paracrine chemical signals. The autocrine chemical signals are basically going to be released by cells and have a local effect on the same type of cell from which they are released from. So for example, if we take a look over here, let's say these represent white blood cells. If this one white blood cell releases some sort of autocrine chemical signal, it will be released, and then it will have a direct effect on another white blood cell in that localized area. Okay, so again, that would be an example of an autocrine chemical signal, where we're directing the same type of cell in that localized area. Paracrine chemical signals, on the other hand, are going to be released by cells that produce an effect on other cell types near that cell from which they are released from without being transported into the blood. And so if we take a look here, here's a white blood cell, let's say, and a muscle cell. We are going to release these paracrine chemical signals from the white blood cell, and again, it will go to a localized area. Maybe there's muscle tissue next to it, and it's going to have a direct effect on it. Okay, again, we don't enter into the bloodstream at this point, but we're having a direct effect from two different types of cells, our white blood cell and our muscle. So the other remaining types of intracellular chemicals include hormones, neurohormones, neurotransmitters, neuromodulators, and pheromones. If we look at hormones and neurohormones, basically they are going to be intracellular chemical signals that are going to be secreted into the circulatory system. And so if we take a look here at a hormone, let's say we have our white blood cell. Our white blood cell is going to create a chemical signal that will then be released into the bloodstream. It will go through circulation until it finds its target cells, and then it will have an impact on those target cells. Whereas a neurohormone is going to have a neuron, okay, instead of just like a white blood cell, it's going to specifically have a neuron that will release that chemical signal that will go into the bloodstream, and then again it will find its target cell. So again, the major difference between a hormone and a neurohormone is the cell that's releasing it. If it has a neuron associated with it, then it is a neurohormone. Neurotransmitters and neuromodulators are intracellular chemical signals that are going to be secreted by the nerve cell. So when we look at how you send messages from one part of your body to another, that's using a neurotransmitter. So we go from one nerve to the next nerve to the next nerve. That is using the neurotransmitter to send the signal. Pheromones, on the other hand, are going to be chemical signals secreted into the environment that modify the behavior and physiology of another individual of the same species. And so when we look at mice, if they're going through mating responses, sometimes they'll release pheromones. Ants will release pheromones in order to find food trails. And again, that will help with their physiology and their behavior. But again, these are the 6 types of intracellular chemical signals that we can have. So when you study the endocrine system, 2 terms that I want you to be aware of and truly know and understand how they work and operate include exocrine versus endocrine. Endocrine basically means that it can secrete within, whereas exocrine means it's going to be secreted and it's going to be moving out away from. And so if we take a look here at endocrine glands are going to secrete a chemical signal within, and then it's going to be transported into the blood, and then it's going to travel away from that gland to other tissues. And then it's going to have its effect on those other tissues that it's going to come in contact with. And so that might be an example like your thyroid gland or an adrenal gland. And so if we take a look down here, this is going to represent an endocrine gland. Again, we're secreting some sort of chemical signal within that gland that will then be released into the bloodstream. The bloodstream will then circulate that specific chemical signal that was secreted, and then it will have an effect on its target tissues away from this gland. Endocrine glands, on the other hand, are going to secrete chemical signals into ducts, which exit the gland and then carry their product to internal or external surfaces, such as your skin or digestive tract. And so when you look at your sweat glands or your salivary glands, they are going to be examples of exocrine glands. Again, we're going to secrete some sort of chemical signal or substance through this gland, and it's going to then come to the surface where it will then have its effect. Again, make sure you know the difference between an endocrine gland and an exocrine gland. So a term that I want to review and make sure you understand is the term hormone, what a hormone specifically is. Well, a hormone is, again, remember, an intercellular chemical signal. It's going to be produced in minute amounts by a collection of cells. Those cells then are going to be secreting that hormone into the interstitial fluid, which will then enter the circulatory system and then be transported some distance in the body until it reaches a specific tissue, which we call a target tissue. And then it's going to have a specific effect on that specific target tissue. Again, so if we take a look here, you're going to have a cell that is going to produce this hormone. It will then go into the bloodstream. Once it goes into the bloodstream, it will then find a target tissue where it will have a specific effect on that tissue. Okay, so again, a hormone specifically has a direct relationship to the bloodstream, and then it finds its target tissues where it can have an effect on that specific tissue it's targeting. So when we look at hormones, we can see that there's 2 categories or classes of hormones. And the categories are going to be determined on how that specific hormone passes through the target cell or tissue. And so the 2 categories we have are water-soluble hormones and lipid-soluble hormones. Water-soluble hormones bind to a membrane-bound receptor. And so if we take a look here at this illustration, we can see that this cell is secreting hormones that are going to be released into the bloodstream. The bloodstream will then carry it to the specific tissue or the specific cell, that cell will then have membrane proteins, peptides or amino acid derivatives that will basically take that hormone, that water-soluble hormone, and then pass it to the nucleus. Whereas lipid-soluble hormones can be passed through that lipid membrane. So if we take a look at this illustration, we can see we're passing this lipid-soluble hormone to the bloodstream. It goes through circulation until it reaches its specific target tissue or cell, and then it can pass through the cell membrane, and then it can come direct contact with our nucleus. So examples of this might include steroids, thyroid hormones, or eicosanoids. In order for a hormone to work and to function, it has to come in contact with a receptor molecule. A receptor molecule is going to be a protein or a glycoprotein where the hormone will bind and then produce a response. So if you take a look here, here's an example of a receptor molecule. Each receptor molecule then will have a specific receptor site. So here's our receptor site, which will be a specific site for a specific hormone. So again, we have these different hormones here, and this specific hormone can come in contact with this specific receptor site. And then because it is so specific, it will then have a specific response to that specific hormone. So depending on the specific type of hormone that is secreted, whether it is a water-soluble hormone or a lipid-soluble hormone, will determine the type of receptor that is needed to have a response. And so for example, if we release a water-soluble hormone, that means it can't pass through the cell membrane. So if it comes in contact with the cell membrane, it can't pass through. So it's going to need what we call a membrane-bound receptor. And so a membrane-bound receptor is going to extend through the cell membrane with the receptor sites on the surface. So when that water-soluble hormone comes in contact with it, it can then have a response. If it is a lipid-soluble hormone, that means it can pass through the cell membrane, so it can have an intracellular receptor. The intracellular receptor is going to be located in the inside of the cytoplasm, or the nucleus of the cell. And so we can pass that through, and then that hormone can have a response with that specific receptor. Again, it's going to be determined off whatever type of hormone will be released to what type of receptor will be needed. So if we take a look at a time comparison for the amount of time needed for a specific hormone to be released, attached to a receptor, and then cause a response, we can see that the membrane-bound receptors compared to the intracellular receptors are much quicker. It's a much more rapid response. Only a few hormones need to bind to a receptor, and then they trigger what we call a cascade effect. And so if we take a look here, let's say a water-soluble hormone is released, and then it comes in contact with the target cell, and then it's going to bind with this membrane-bound receptor. It will then activate enzyme 1, enzyme 1, enzyme 1, and then those enzymes will then activate enzymes 2. So it then splits off. And so for each enzyme 1 activated, 2 enzymes are going to be activated down here. So again, we have enzyme 2, enzyme 2, enzyme 2, enzyme 2, enzyme 2, enzyme 2, and then we could go again and we could activate enzyme 3 until we have this physiological effect on our specific cell and tissue. So again, it goes very rapid for a membrane-bound receptor. An intracellular receptor, on the other hand, takes a very long time. It takes a long time because it's going to change and alter the DNA, which will then alter our mRNA, which will then create a new protein. So it takes time for this lipid-soluble hormone to come through, come in contact with our nucleus, change our DNA, change our mRNA, then change that protein that will be assembled. And so again, I just want to make sure you understand that the rates are going to be very different for a membrane-bound receptor compared to an intracellular receptor. Well, that concludes our lesson for today. I hope this was a helpful podcast, and until next time, remember, keep studying anatomy and physiology.